ask those in the public gallery, yes, there are some people, to turn off all electronic devices, with the exception of committee tablets. Can I seek your agreement that agenda item 4 is recorded by Hansard? Great. Thank you. Okay, we'll begin with apologies. I have one from Michaela Boyle. Anyone aware of any other apologies? Not at the moment. Okay. We'll move on now to item number 2, which is the draft minutes. There are pages 5 to 9 of your packs. And I'll ask you, are members content that the draft minutes are record of proceedings? Great, thank you. And that they be published, therefore, on the website. Thank you. And we move on to number 3, matters arising. Table of requests for information from DFP. The summary table of requests is at pages 11 to 13 of your packs and are merely for noting at this stage. That leads us on to item number 4, consultation on regulations for the Civil Service Pension Scheme, Northern Ireland 2015. We have a departmental briefing, and I'll ask Mrs. Grace Nesbitt, Head of Pensions Divisions, CHR, Department of Finance Personnel, Mr. Peter Phillip, Civil Service Pensions Branch, Department of Finance Personnel, Miss Margaret Coyle, Policy and Legislation, Civil Service Pensions, CHR, Department of Finance and Personnel, and Mrs. Blanage Smith, Policy and Legislation, Civil Service Pensions, CHR, Department of Finance and Personnel. That's a bit of a mouthful to get through. It's one of your delegation isn't here for this particular session, just 3 of you for this one. Yes,
thank you. There's actually 2 items I'd like to update the committee on.
Yes, we're beginning with the consultations and regulations for the civil service pensions, and then the valuations and employer cost cap changes.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
But you're going to cover both now.
I am. Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much. You're very welcome. And if you are ready to make an opening statement,
yes,
you'd be very welcome.
I'd like to give just a short overview of the secondary legislation that's proposed, just giving you a little bit of the background, the actions taken to date, what the key changes are and the next steps, and then I'll be happy to take members' questions, and I suggest we pause then and then move into the next session after that. The Public Service Pensions Act 2014 Northern Ireland, as you'll be aware, provides a framework for the reform of public service pensions in Northern Ireland, and DFP is now taking forward work to reform the civil service pension scheme. So I just want to make absolutely clear, unlike our previous sessions that I've appeared before the committee, this session deals solely with the civil service. This session is not about the wider public service. April 2015, as we all know very well now, is a critical and significant deadline, and failure to meet it, as a committee will be well aware, will result in a financial penalty of around 60 million for the civil service scheme. The changes that I'm going to talk about today propose that they will be implemented through the introduction of the Public Service, Civil Servants and Others Pension Regulation Northern Ireland 2014. But just to keep it a little bit shorter for the purpose of this briefing, I intend just to refer to them as the new 2015 Pension Scheme Regulations. I previously briefed the committee on all aspects of the Policy and Public Service Pensions Act Northern Ireland and the main features of scheme design, and I can confirm that the draft regulations for the new Civil Service 2015 scheme reflect the basic principles of the scheme design set out in the Act. They are also comparable to the scheme being proposed in Great Britain. The regulations for the civil service scheme in Great Britain were informed by views contributed at the earlier consultation with the unions in Great Britain. The draft regulations for the scheme in Northern Ireland have been subject to consultation with our civil service trade unions during the drafting process, which actually commenced late in 2013. consultation on the regulations for the new scheme was launched on the 9th of June, and it will run for 6 weeks, closing on the 18th of July. I do realise this is shorter than usual, but I think it's important to note that the civil trade unions were supportive of a more focused and shortened consultation, and this was because the civil service pensions had previously completed a 12-week consultation on the policy intent, and it shared all stages of the regulations in their development. The letter and consultation document issued to the committee on the 10th of June, and it details the main features of the new scheme, so I don't intend to cover it again in this briefing. You have it in your written briefing. Just to highlight a couple of the key changes. Normal scheme pension age will be linked to state pension age, and this link will be reviewed, as members will be aware, every 2 years following amendment to the Public Service Pension Act Northern Ireland. There will also be a single pension scheme design based on a career average earning, and career average scheme provides pensions that are more proportionate to what all members pay in contributions. Final salary schemes provide up to twice as much in benefits to higher earners and those with faster salary progression throughout their career, compared to members of the scheme who have a flatter salary progression profile throughout their career. Scheme members with low or moderate earnings therefore tend to get better benefits from a career average scheme than a final salary scheme with the same overall average cost. The new scheme design for 2015 is similar to a scheme that we already have in the civil service called NUVOS, which is current defined benefit career average scheme that was on offer to all staff starting in the civil service since 2007. An automatic lump sum is not provided for in the new scheme. However, scheme members will continue to be able to take up to 25% of the value of their pension as a lump sum. Another new feature in the 2015 scheme is that a member can choose to buy what's termed an effective pension age of up to 3 years earlier than their normal pension age to avoid actuarial reduction, but this cannot be earlier than age 65. This option will be paid for by contributions being deducted from the member's monthly pay. And finally, on employee contribution rates, these will be on average at 5.6%. The majority of scheme members will pay less than the average 5.6%, and the highest will pay a larger proportion of their salary after tax. The key points to note on employee contributions are the new contributions will be based on actual salaries rather than full-time equivalent, and this will therefore benefit those members who work any sort of reduced hours or part-time working. There will also be some tapering for those in classic scheme, currently earning less than $15,000, who otherwise would see a significant increase in 2015. And the new contribution structure will apply to all members, irrespective of what scheme they were in when they joined the civil service. The written submission does give members a table of what the new contribution rates are going to be. In the interest of time, I'm not going to cover that now. The contribution rates are based very much on the proposed final agreement which was signed off with the unions in Great Britain. This set contribution rates to be broadly similar, net of tax relief for all members. And one important point I would just draw members' attention to, the pay band £47,001 to £150,000 corresponds to the higher rate of tax band of 40%, and this reflects a recommendation by the National Trade Union Committee so as to ensure that all members within the band are higher taxpayers and that the whole of their pension contribution is eligible for higher rate relief. The bands and rates will be set up to and including 2018-19, and they will be reviewed following the next scheme valuation unless it becomes clear the targeted yield is not being delivered. And there really are no circumstances we can envisage that this would arise. Another important element in the new Civil Service 2015 scheme implementation is what's termed full protection and tapered protection provisions. Although the majority of existing scheme members will move to the new scheme in April 15, there are a number of members who will receive either full or tapered protection. This means that full protection members who are within 10 years of their normal pension age at April 12 in their existing scheme will not move to the new scheme. scheme members with current normal pension age of 60, who in April 12 were between 46 years and 6 months and 50, will have a choice, it's termed tapered protection, of continuing to accrue benefits in their existing arrangements on a tapered basis. This will also apply to members between 51 years and 6 months and 55 with a current normal pension age of 65. To just explain those who joined later, for example, the 2007 NUVOS scheme has a retirement age of 65 rather than 60. Civil service pensions will provide an options exercise in the autumn, and this will give members who are eligible for tapered protection the choice of either moving to the new 2015 scheme or remaining within current arrangements until their tapered enrolment date. One final point, and this really will be reflected in our next session, the overall policy for public service pension schemes is still being finalised in relation to the percentage of the employer's cap. This will need to be updated in the draft regulations. The regulations may also require other amendments to take account of further minor changes which may be proposed during the consultation period. We will, of course, consult on these further changes with the civil service trade unions, and happy to update the committee as well. The next steps will be we will publish the Department's response to the consultation, and again, the committee again when it resumes session again in the autumn on the outcome of the consultation. It is our intention to lay the scheme regulations in the Assembly in the autumn to allow time for implementation of the new 2015 scheme. The regulations, committee will be aware, are subject to negative resolution and have been written in accordance with the Public Service Pension Act. That's just a very short overview of the key elements of the scheme, and happy to take questions any members may have.
Okay, well, can I start off and ask, you mentioned there that the reason for the shortness of the consultation period was because you did have some prior consultations. But, I mean, this current period of consultation, it's running into the summer period, which is never a good time for consultation because holidays and so on and so forth, and you're less likely to get as full a response to the consultation as you might otherwise get. And you know, some people might say that you're not adhering to good practice in public consultation by doing that.
I think we did take a measured view, and that's why I did highlight to the committee. I'm very conscious that it is a shortened period and also that it's into the summer months. I think it's helpful to look at what has gone before. In terms of the unions, they have been engaged and consulted in this from December 2013. Indeed, I was very anxious they got a draft of our regulations just before Christmas, and they did. And also in terms of the wider consultation, we did have, as I said, a full 12-week consultation on the policy intent. And the regulations that we are now proposing follow that policy intent and follow the key elements of that. So in a sense, we have already had a full consultation on what the key changes are in our secondary legislation. We have been engaged with the union for over 6 months now on it. And I would also note that the unions did not raise any objection, because we did discuss this with them in detail. Given that they had had the draft regulations for so long to consider, given that the GB unions had been involved as well, and finally given that we had consulted quite extensively and for quite a lengthy period of time earlier on this year on the policy intent. So that was the reasons for the shortened consultation, Chair.
Okay. You mentioned there that you had consultations around the policy intent, and that most of the policy features are now contained in the regulations. Are there any significant differences between the policy intent and what actually we have in the regulations now?
No.
None?
None.
Okay. Can I ask you then, you obviously are dealing with the civil service for which your department is responsible.
Yes.
Can you give us any indication on any progress that has been made by other departments in consulting with those affected For example, teachers, health workers, firefighters?
I don't have the detail of that to hand, but I can assure the committee I meet with officials right across all the public service pension schemes in Northern Ireland, and they have been engaged and consulting with their unions right across all the public service scheme for some months now. Indeed, that would have started last year, and they're looking at preparing similar draft regulations and having a consultation exercise on those as well.
You said you have been liaison, consulting with the people in the other departments. What's your role in relation to those other schemes?
My role in DF and the role of DFP is
That's
really
what I'm asking.
Right, is really to support the implementation, to share best practice and to have a coherent approach as far as possible. Obviously, taking account of differences which ministers who are responsible for their own specific scheme may wish to propose. So it's really to get a sense of, are we on track or are we not? Is there anything that can be done to support or to facilitate engagement with other officials, and indeed to help them with the unions as well?
From the whatever limited amount of consultation responses you've received to date, can you tell us of any emerging issues?
We haven't received any responses to date. We've had a few inquiries, and the inquiries have been around wanting clarification on, for example, why contribution rates were increasing. Because I think members had thought, for example, if you were in the full protection, the magic age 50 as I refer to it, at age 12, I think people took that to mean that their contribution rate would not change. People also may have had the view that the 25-year guarantee, as it's been called, may also have meant that contribution rates would not have changed, though that's very clearly not what the legislation says. So we've had a few queries in the division, but we have yet not actually got a formal response to the consultation.
Just to go back to the other departments, you said you had a role in supporting and advising them. Can you keep this committee up to date in general with how those schemes are progressing?
Yes, I can provide an update. I can provide a written update to the committee in September, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, okay. Can I just go back to one of the differences between the current scheme and the new scheme? You said under the current scheme, on retirement, retirees receive a lump sum plus their pension, obviously.
Yes.
Under the new scheme, they won't receive a lump sum, but they'll receive 25% of their pension.
Sorry, just to make that absolutely clear, they will receive their pension. They can exercise an option to take a proportion of their pension as a lump sum, and that proportion is up to 25% of their pension.
So they can take a 25% plus a reduced pension?
Yes.
Or the full pension?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's been in place since 2002, because the premium scheme and the NUVA scheme also don't have an automatic lump sum, so that's nothing new to the 2015 scheme.
Okay. Any members got questions?
Chair, can I just ask, you're running a short sort of period of consultation because you don't think it's necessary. No, it's an unfair question, but that's what we're here for.
Okay.
I'm a little bit concerned that the other schemes are going to be tripping along behind you quite a bit. Do you think that's a fair comment?
I'm not sure that other schemes will actually follow a 6-week consultation. It will be very much up to what they view and the level of engagement there's been with their sector, and also the view of their particular minister who's responsible for that scheme. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that every other scheme will follow.
But will they all apply? Will the pensions all actually, the regulations kick in the same date?
Yes, they will. And it's really, my view was that it was better to have our regulations through and to have a little bit more time, because the timescale is tight, and I've never made any bones about that to this committee. The timescale is extremely tight and challenging. It's not the timescale that we have set. It's been set for us. And in my view, it was better that we pressed ahead with our regulations, and the trade union colleagues also understood that, so that we had more time to actually look at implementation to make sure that we implemented it properly.
And what is the date for all regulations to be in place?
Well, there isn't actually a date for the regulations to be in place. The new scheme must be in place by April 15. But when you work back from that and look at just the logistics of implementation, you know, changing your IT system, communicating the details with it, going through an options exercise, which we have in the civil service scheme, that's why I'm keen that we press ahead. So other schemes may take a different view and may have their regulations coming on slightly later in the day. That is a matter for them. The key date to bear in mind is April 15.
A bit messy, that, isn't it?
Well, it's really up to each minister and each sector to decide on their specific approach. I don't have the power or authority to say your regulations must be in by a certain date. That's a matter for each sector to look at and to weigh up the risks and where they wish to give more emphasis to on the implementation process.
I think that's going to cause a bit of problems with some people if the regulations are in place. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Peter?
No, to be honest on the question, you'd already asked the question. Okay. Really, I just want to find out to what extent, if you like, in framing these, and Grace had indicated it was effectively, if you like, only restricted to the civil service, to what extent it maybe had then knock-on implications for the wider public service, but I think this has been covered, I think, the response that you've given.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously been a controversial reform, but nevertheless the committee and the wider assembly have, I think, buttoned down on it. I'm concerned about the timing too, but not necessarily an argument about the rationale of the shortened consultation period, but the timing of it. July holiday, whatever. You know, you might as well just lop another fortnight off it and say that's. You know, that is, I think, just going to give rise to even more controversy, unnecessary. Could it not have been produced earlier, even if you had a rationale for a foreshortened consultation period?
All I can say is that we worked as fast and as hard as we could, and we just simply were not in a position to produce it anything earlier. And I think, you know, the factors, and I don't want to repeat, but the fact that we had actually consulted on the policy intent, and the fact also that the unions were content and fully engaged. Secondary legislation is not a thing that a lot of people are going out there are going to read, and I'm not expecting to get a full response. And even if we had a 12-week response, not over any holiday period, I still do not think we would have got a really full response.
You're in danger of undermining your original rationale for shortening it by taking that approach. But those who are upset, and there are many, by this reform, will, I think, they will note the time, even if they don't read the detail of the consultation document. Yeah. This is about implementation. And I'm not going to hold up this meeting on this point. I just think it's a bit cack-handed to put out a consultation, particularly in the first fortnight in July. And I I just can't accept that people didn't think of that as a factor that could be used just to throw mud and to raise kind of issues.
Well, we did launch it in June. We didn't launch.
I know when you launched it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm saying if you launched it with a tail end, you might as well have upped another fortnight off it as well, you know, and people will see that as an element of sharp practice. I think it was completely unnecessary.
We did speak to the equality officer about this particular issue, and what she did say, and historically there's been, when you're consulting on regulations, in a lot of cases you don't even do a public consultation, it's more with the trade unions. And we do know for a fact that any time we've consulted with trade unions on the specific regulations, the response hasn't been in any great detail. They're more interested in the policy intent, actually, than what the actual regulations are the nitty-gritty of the regulations, which is something that we've come across before.
Well, I'm more inclined to just kind of, having made my point, drop it, because the more answers I get which kind of say, like, they're just tick boxing and it's not important anyway and blah, 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 are just going to dig a hole deeper. I think just please make a note of what I'm saying. Consultations in the first fortnight of August would have very little credibility with anyone.
Can I ask you, in light of the fact at a previous briefing, I think on the 9th of January, the department said that there would be scope within the secondary legislation to design local pension schemes which vary from parity, provided that they're within the cost ceiling of the GB equivalent schemes. How is this scope for flexibility, how is that borne out in the consultation paper in terms of encouraging respondents to offer alternative options that the department may not yet have considered?
Yeah, I think that the consultation paper asks exactly that question. If there are alternatives that people want to propose. I say we have been engaged in consulting with unions on this matter for over 6 months, and there's nothing which has emerged from those engagements to suggest that we should do anything differently from what has been put in place or is being put in place in Great Britain. But the consultation document does ask that question, so there is scope there if anybody out there wishes to raise it. There's nothing that we have thought of as officials, and there's nothing to date that the unions have proposed either.
Okay. What assurance can you offer that the consultation will be meaningful and that any proposals made will be given sufficient consideration? And we have heard this morning several opinions on the timing and the length of the consultation. Your argument is that you previously consulted on some of the proposals at policy intent stage.
Yes.
You know, quite often a person's frame of mind when responding to policy intents may not be the same as when they're responding to the actual regulations. So, you know, there is a difference there. So I'm asking you how you can reassure us that the proposals will be given sufficient consideration, and in light of what you've heard here today, would you consider lengthening the consultation period, say to the end of September?
I think the end of September would cause us real problems with implementation, and I do have to bear in mind the financial penalty if we fail to implement. And there is a process to go through once we have our regulations made to share and communicate that. Civil service has a unique feature as well, which is quite technical, but I referred to it as the options exercise for those in tapered protection. And to do that properly, we need to have our regulations in place. So we need to do that in October. Pensions is a life-changing decision, so people need to be given a significant period of time to decide on that. The timescale is really tight, so if we start putting things back, Chair, until September, it jeopardises a number of key milestones that we have to hit and hit successfully. In terms of your other issue that you've raised about giving a response to the issues raised in consultation, I can assure you we will do that, and we will set out in writing what the responses we've had to the consultation exercise, and indeed what our view is of those responses, and whether those responses will result in a change, and if so, what that change will be. And if they will not result in a change, the rationale for us not accepting a change that's been proposed. And we will share those documents with the committee. And as I said, happy to come along also in September and brief the committee on that again.
Well, getting back to the length of consultation again, you know, the first 2 weeks of July, they are traditionally the period when probably most civil servants take their annual leave. On that basis, since you said that the time frame will not allow consultation to continue until the end of September, would you consider it continuing it until the end of August, say?
I think then that just leaves us very, very, very tight, because we have to then do a response to the consultation exercise, and we simply do not have a lot of time on our hand. And in my experience, if people are going, and I'm actually sure that a lot of civil servants do actually take July, in some instances it's more August than July, but in terms of people wishing to respond to the consultation, we have publicised it extensively. And people are well aware of it, and people were also expecting it. So I do think, I mean, not everybody's going to be off from the middle of June until when the consultation closes on the 18th of July. And I do think if people wish to make their voices heard, that they will indeed do so. And again, I would emphasise that most of the really detailed responses that we get are actually from the trade unions rather than individual members, and they're well aware of this time frame, and they indeed will respond within this time frame.
Okay. In the event of any equality issues arising from the consultation, what assurance can you give us that there would be a full equality impact assessment carried out? There'll only be an equality impact assessment if the equality screening required that. And to date, the equality screening exercise, which we have published as well, has indicated that a full equality impact assessment is not required. If another equality issue emerges as a result, then of course we will consider that. Okay. Before we move on to the employer cost cap, any other members got a question? Okay. So, Grace, you're staying on, and I thank your colleagues for their contributions. We'll move on now to the second part of the briefing, which concerns the draft directions and regulations on valuations and employer cost cap changes in respect of public service pensions. And Grace has been joined by Blanet Smith and Stephen Ball, both of the department, of course. Same parish.
Same parish, haven't changed department. Haven't been renamed yet either.
Thank you, Grace. Whenever you're ready, if you want to make an opening statement.
All right. Could I just say that I do realise this is quite a technical area. So there may be questions that members ask which I'll need to follow up in writing, so I'll get that in right at the start, and I will focus on the high-level issues, just give a brief overview, and then obviously if members have any questions, be happy to take them. As I say, the committee will be familiar with the Public Service Pension Act, and I'm not going to repeat all that. Just to remind members that the thrust of the reforms was to manage increasing scheme costs, to reduce the cost risk to public purse, and indeed the purpose behind that was so that we could keep public service pension schemes, to actually make them sustainable in the longer term. The valuation and cost cap directions are a key component part for implementation of that reform. They provide a common approach for scheme valuation and cost control processes, and I should say this is across all the public service pension schemes. This issue is relevant to all the schemes, not just the civil service. This common approach for scheme valuation and cost control processes was indeed recommended by Lord Hutton, and it's designed to aid transparency and effective oversight and analysis of public service schemes to help ensure that we have that fair balance of risk between scheme members and the taxpayer for the future. These directions will apply across the new main public service pension schemes from 2015. And just to remind members, those schemes include police, firefighters, health, teachers, civil service and indeed local government. This was quite a different type of consultation. This was a consultation with the unions, and DFP launched that consultation with the unions on the 16th of June, and it will run to the 11th of July, and this time frame was agreed with trade union side. The Department wrote to the committee concerning the commencement of the consultation on the 13th of June, with details on the principles it has had in regard to developing these directions. I'll turn now to the content of the valuation and cost cap directions. First of all, the valuation. Scheme valuations are undertaken to determine the scheme liabilities, and data from the valuation process is used to illustrate the monies accruing to the scheme, the cost of providing pension to members, and the shortfall or surplus between the two. That's a very short summary of how pensions are funded. There are 3 possible levers to manage changes in the scheme liabilities: employee contribution rates, employer contribution rates, and the level of benefit provided by the scheme. The directions set out how and when scheme valuations should be completed, together with the processes for and the demographic assumptions and the scheme data which should be used in their completion. In these draft directions, there are issues still to be clarified in terms of how we treat past liabilities for the schemes here. Turning to the employer cost cap, the directions provide for an employer cost cap to be established in each scheme to control costs to public service employers. They set out how this cap should be set, measured and operated. The cost cap for each scheme will operate within set margins of a cost cap. And this is not my language, this is the language of the legislation. We talk about a cost cap floor and a cost cap ceiling, and that will be set in regulations produced by DFP. And the margin that's proposed, they talk about a corridor, roll into buildings, and they talk about a 2% corridor. Where the margins are breached, the responsible authority for the scheme will be required to take action to return scheme costs within the margins. Finally, the direction set out requirements for responsible authorities to include details in their regulations on the actions it will take to achieve this if the margins set for the cost cap are breached. In terms of next steps, the Department will consider and address issues raised in response to the consultation before finalising the directions. The Department is also required to formally consult with the Government Actuary before making the directions. This is actually a requirement specified in the Public Service Pensions Act. And the directions will be made administratively on the signature of 2 senior officers of the Department. No assembly procedure applies to these directions. As advised in the Department's letter to the Committee on the 13th of June, the regulations that will be made by the Department to set the cost cap margin provided in the directions will be subject to negative resolution procedure in the Assembly. This is a very brief overview, and I'm happy to take any questions that members may have.
Okay, thanks very much. Can I ask you what further discussions, consultation and so on with the unions to date, what sort of views have they conveyed to you?
The unions are, I think it's fair to say, broadly content with the approach that's been taken. It is quite a technical and very detailed issue, but there certainly are a number of people within
Are they
the
expressing any concerns?
There's a few unknowns, and the unknowns I've already highlighted in my opening remarks about how we deal with past liabilities. And the unions have indicated that they will certainly work with us and consider options as it emerges as to how we're actually going to deal with that. But there's been no...
But do you have scope to deal with those?
Yes.
You do, right. So it's a matter of coming to agreement with the unions on it.
Consult with the view to reach an agreement. I think this is an area where unions and officials genuinely have an agreed shared agenda, is how I would describe that, to look at how we can actually get something in place which fits Northern Ireland. Not at all.
So there is a possibility then that those issues can be sorted out?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. So can you tell us what are the next steps and the timetable in terms of the various pieces of subordinate legislation which arise from the Act, and when can you tell us about the outcome of the consultations and your proposed way forward?
The outcome of the consultation will be completed and made available to the committee for when they resume in September. In terms of the next steps, we would hope to make the directions again in September, and again said they'll be made administratively. And in terms of the regulations, we would hope to press on with those in September, possibly into October as well. So certainly early autumn is how I would describe it.
And can I ask you, is the consultation period for the cost cap the same as for the pension scheme in general?
No, it's shorter. It's a very and the consultation has been done on a different basis because the requirement is to consult with the unions. It's not a wider consultation exercise.
The reason I'm asking you was because the impression we got from the briefing on the 23rd of January was that the consultations would run from March to May 2014. Those were the timings you gave us on the 23rd of January.
Right. This was probably for the secondary legislation, was it? For the previous session that I referred to, not the evaluation and directions?
Well, it definitely was for the first one.
Yes.
We thought that possibly it referred to the cost cap as well.
No, it wouldn't have referred to that. It was the timetable I think you're referring to, Chair, was for our originally proposed timetable on the secondary legislation, and with hindsight that was just extremely ambitious.
Okay. Any members got questions on this, Leslie?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I know it's complex, but I'm just wondering if we get where the costs get off the floor and get actually above the ceiling, right?
Yes.
How do we get them back in there? Where does the fresh injection come from?
Down the corridor.
Money.
Down the corridor, the cellar. Again, just to go back, the three levers that I have said, the idea is that there won't continually be more money from the taxpayer, money for the employer, put into these schemes. That's the whole thrust of reform, so there is a control. So the levers which can be controlled if it breaches the 2% corridor are, as I've said, one, to look at employee contributions and or to look at the scheme design or scheme benefits, whatever way you want to describe that.
I haven't mentioned employer contribution.
Well, employer contribution will be set within this cost cap. So there will be a margin, a 2% margin, where things can veer. But the idea, the thrust of these reforms is that employer contribution don't just keep going up and up and up outside that margin. That other things will be changed, and the other things that can be changed are employee contribution and or some element of scheme design, and that will be up to the responsible authority, the sector responsible for each scheme, to look at and to determine a way forward.
I hate to suggest the idea, but to bring logic into this, there only are two parties to this, the employee and the employer, and they jointly fund the scheme, isn't that so?
Yes.
So therefore, if it goes outside the house, right, they both are responsible for bringing it back in, and surely that should be done on the basis of sharing the actual cost.
I'm not quite sure I follow your question, because the costs, this will set a very clear framework as to
Well, if
how
we can link
costs
that,
can be
perhaps,
shared.
make it easy for you, Grace, we can link that to the defined benefit scheme, the old idea of a scheme where you actually had a minimum funding requirement. How does it relate to that?
This is a different approach, and
So how do you get more money if you need it?
well, you stop spending the money because you don't have it. That's how you do it, because you will be looking at a thorough scheme valuation. It will be predicting what your scheme liabilities are. You'll be carefully monitoring that, and you can see basically if you're not getting enough from your employees and or you're spending too much in terms of the benefits the scheme is providing. And the idea is that those things will be adjusted in a very measured and a controlled way. So it won't be that you'll suddenly wake up and find out our scheme liabilities have increased dramatically. Schemes will be doing very thorough valuations, and will be looking, based on assumptions, I do accept that, to actually predict what their future scheme liabilities will be and to take action in a timely way.
Yes, but I still haven't got the grasp of this bit. To do that, I think both the employer and the employee have to contribute. Can't just be one of them, surely.
Well, both the employee and employer are contributing.
Well, they are, but I'm talking about because of this notional deficit, if it were to occur.
Yeah. It's not like a funded scheme where you have a fund, because public service pension schemes, certainly for the main schemes, are unfunded schemes. And I think
They're underwritten, you see, that's the difference.
they are underwritten, and the money comes out of AMI funding, so it is a different approach to public service pensions. But the cost control is a huge leap forward to putting in a measured and robust financial regime for managing costs going forward.
We'll come back to this idea of what happens when it goes outside that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Just to continue on that, from the point of cost control, what are the indicators that will point to the way to control the cost? Because as you said, there are three ways. There's the employees' contribution, the employer's contribution, and the benefits.
Do you mean, just so I'm clear, just as your member have said, when it appears that costs are going out of control?
Yeah.
It's simply those three levers, and to exercise a variance in one
So
of those.
all of those three levers are used to a greater or lesser extent.
It will be used to a greater or lesser extent for the employee contribution, because I wouldn't want people to have the wrong idea. Certainly, the intention is that those rates will stay in place, as I said in the first session, unless something very untoward happens. So it's anticipated that the employee rates will be in place for a number of years until the next valuation, and then it will be informed by a rolling regular programme of valuation. The employer will be limited to how much, because there is a sense that we can't just keep increasing the employer contributions.
So that leaves you with benefits.
So that leaves you with benefits and/or employee contributions, but the employer has got a level of variance as well.
And Mr. Bradley, each of the schemes will have a requirement to put under their regulations what steps they will take to bring the schemes back in within the cost cap, should the cost cap be breached. So that will be covered in the regulations for each scheme.
Right, yeah. No, yeah, I understand that. We're just talking about in general, the mechanisms that will be used.
But in general, I think those are the only levers that can be deployed.
Just to expand on Donald's point, those are the levers available, and they will be discussed by the pension boards and the pension advisory boards. That will provide an extra level of scrutiny for the schemes to make these decisions, and they will have an autonomy to make it at scheme level. I'm sure you're aware those pension boards will have both employee and employer representatives, so they can address those issues of where that cost should lie within the cost cap mechanism.
Because part of the new governance going forward as well. Part of the new governance arrangements going forward as well.
Okay. Any other members got questions?
Just to make one last point, Grace. If the mix of your membership changes dramatically, small numbers coming in the bottom, big numbers going out the top, is there a major problem?
Potentially, yes, but career average is a different approach. It should be a more balanced way also of controlling costs, because you won't
In the
have
long
big...
term, but in the
Yes.
short term, you've got a real risk.
There is a risk, but the evidence to date has shown that despite increased employee contributions, that actually membership rates are staying very high, and indeed in some sectors, like local government, I understand auto-enrolment, which members will be familiar with, where people are put into a pension scheme, whether they like it or not, every 3 years, that's actually leading to an increase in membership, and that's having a very beneficial effect.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there's no other questions, thanks very much, Chris and her team. And there were a number of issues which you said you would
Yes.
keep us updated on in due
Yes.
course.
Yes.
So we look forward to that.
Yes, and we will, if the committee are agreeable, get a slot in September,
September.
whenever you resume, and update you on those other matters.
You don't have one in July, no?
I'm happy to have one in July. I'm not off July or August.
We're okay. Yeah. Be careful what you wish for, Mitchell.
What date?
I'm not doing anything on the 12th tonight.
Neither am I.
We'll leave to Mr McLaughlin to make arrangements there for himself if he wishes to pursue the matter.
We've had
Okay,
that
thanks
before.
very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure. Just a moment. Just while during that session, I got sent an apology from Ian McRae. Got that.
Okay, we'll record that. Okay, members, we'll move on to the next item. Private Members Bill, a bill to make amateur sports clubs exempt from rates. We have a follow-up briefing from Colin from Assembly Research, and this session has been allocated about 20 minutes. So, Colin, whenever you've got yourself in place there, we'll be very happy to hear your presentation.
If we take 20 minutes on this, it'll be a miracle because, as you'll have seen from the note, it's really, essentially, it's two very short pieces of information. Just to follow up on something that I didn't know when Mr. McCall asked me during the last session.
Yeah.
And that was about the. I had provided information on 3 of the 5 eligibility criteria for the CAST scheme on the basis that those are the ones that we had discussed previously and that, or had been discussed rather, in the committee. So this is just filling in the gaps about the location and management conditions. So the first of these is a location criterion, which basically means that a club, sports club, can be a member of the CAST scheme as long as it's a member. It's in the EC, in the European Community, or relevant territories, and then relevant territories are Iceland and Norway, so that's the European Economic Area, I think. So it's just extending it out. So in the event that the bill went ahead and the rates exemption were to be provided to sports clubs based in Northern Ireland, it also has to be able to, in some way, and I can't really understand the circumstances in which this would happen, but if there was a sports club which was based in Iceland, say, which owned property in Northern Ireland, it would qualify for a rates exemption as well.
Presume we're talking about the country rather than the frozen goods store?
Well, I believe so, yeah, absolutely. So I think that was probably introduced as to ensure that the scheme complied with, the European Union treaty obligations more than anything else. And then the second one is the management criterion, which is just to ensure that the club is managed by people who are deemed to be fit and proper. And then I included a little bit from the HMRC's guidance on that to just to explain how that criterion works. And basically, the management condition is assumed to be met. So it's assumed automatically that someone who is the manager of a club is fit and proper, unless they have reason to believe otherwise. So it's I suppose it's a test just to make sure that perhaps somebody who maybe has been disqualified from being a director of a company through insolvency proceedings or something like that didn't end up running a CAST registered club or something along those lines. But it's basically down to the tax authorities then to make inquiries if they want to. So that's really all that's in the note. If there are any questions, I can take them. Or
Thanks for that update, Colin. Any questions, Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Colin. And I suppose, to be fair, this might be more with an additional research. In terms of the CAST scheme, where it is operated, be it either, I suppose, in terms of the implementation in Great Britain or the Republic of Ireland, it's noticeable, and I suppose this is where the European side of this comes in, that where they have had exemptions, which by nature are in some way qualified. So across the water, it's been on the basis that there's, as with here, there's a high level of automatic exemption up to a certain point. But if you get full exemptions on a discretionary basis, and consequently, therefore, there's not a full automatic entitlement.
yeah,
Similarly, with the Republic of Ireland, there is an issue. I mean, what they have done is they have provided the exemption, but they provide the exemption not again to blanketly to sports clubs or even those that qualify as CASC in that regard, but to in specific elements of it. So, for example, I think on that occasion it's largely the issue of the physical grounds that are used. But for example, if it's a bar,
the bar was the disqualification.
is
that's
disqualified
the
and
factor for it.
exempt, etc., etc. I mean, I'm just wondering, is there a situation where what potentially would be proposed, which would be to go with 100% for all clubs on that basis, rather than a discretionary bit or those that qualify in certain bits? I mean, is it possible to see whether that potentially has any degree of understanding, as there is some anxiety has been expressed that potentially a completely blanket exemption might create problems from European law point of view, and particularly that it might constitute a form of state aid?
Well, there was, if you remember back to the discussion a couple of weeks ago, there is an ongoing issue about a challenge in relation to state aid from the Golf Club Owners Association. Now that's with the car scheme as it exists in GB, rather than what you would be proposing, or what the bill may introduce in Northern Ireland.
What's being proposed here takes perhaps, shall we say, things which have happened elsewhere, and takes it, at least because of the fact that it would be 100%, it would be automatic, and cover all those that it. I mean, I appreciate there may be certain qualifying criteria, but that potentially it takes it to a level even beyond what the challenges at present. And I'm just thinking, if it's entirely blanket, is that a more clear-cut case of potentially something that could constitute sort of a breach of EU law? Whereas the more, it's interesting, other jurisdictions have taken a slightly more nuanced approach, whether that's to try and provide a degree of protection from challenge in that regard. I'm just wondering.
Well, I'm not qualified to speak on European law. I can't. I'm not allowed to do that.
I appreciate some of that.
But if you recall the previous paper, in fact, I haven't brought it with me, but there is a distinction about the way the rates relief currently works in Northern Ireland from the way the car scheme operates in GB, in that there is this apportionment of the relief based on how much of a club's turnover relates to its sporting activities and how much relates to its social functions. So without a sort of sight of the private member's bill and knowing exactly what is proposed, but I suppose my assumption would be that there's nothing that Mr. Mackay has said would indicate he's suggesting that system should change. So if
the only thing in that is, again, comparing it. I mean, England's a position, for example, Scotland and Wales as well, where it then becomes, there's an element of discretionary quality to it, and an element which, can then be awarded under certain circumstances under that discretion. Distinctions seem to be with the bill that if it ticks certain boxes, it's automatically awarded, and it's awarded 100% in that regard, and that might.
That seemed to be, that's as far as I know, that is the proposal, that it would be 100% exemption for all eligible clubs. I suppose there's no reason why the committee might want to think about that more, and there's no reason why there couldn't be a bit of discussion about whether there's an idea of having some kind of discretionary criteria or something to allow those kind of considerations to be brought in. But I think before you got to the stage of deciding whether or not you wanted discretion, you would need to meet the fundamental question which I'd raised last time, which was about who's going to bear the additional cost. Because that will influence your thinking in terms of who's in the right position to be exercising any discretion, and if it's something that's going to be passed to the councils to bear the cost of, then the councils should presumably have the decision on.
I suppose whether the gap. I mean, the other issue with that is whether the gap may not be that enormous in pure monetary terms. Once you create a particular exemption, then people sometimes they can then adjust behaviour to potentially much more easily qualify for that. So it's not necessarily, if you like, taking the position as is. It's a bit like, again, it's maybe to draw a different analogy. If you look at the issue of prescription charges and the broader level on it, there will be a certain amount of financial implication that was there in terms of the abolition of them. Then, if you're simply taking behaviour as is, then it's a particular bit. If you then take into account that people then feel if something is going to be free, therefore I will take more of it, or in this case, if the situation that it means, and we had last week people in from the business community, for instance, who had very major concerns over the level of business rates and saying, you know, we want to see these reduced or whatever. If there's an avenue which people can take which can then exempt them from rates, as to what extent they will try, to some extent, to adjust behaviour to therefore qualify, more than simply just be a question of what is there at present in terms of
I suppose there's always a, I mean, absolutely right, there's always a risk, and that's really the foundation of economics generally, is that people respond to incentives. So if there is an incentive there, then people will rational people will adjust their behaviour in order to maximise their outcomes in response to that incentive. But whether or not there's a significant risk of the business community being able to avail of the proposed sports exemption in order to somehow minimise their rates liability,
I'm not going to
know.
name it, but I know, for example, of a commercial organisation involved with sports,
right,
who are paying significant rates, who not that long ago said to me, we're fed up paying this amount. You know what, we might as well just, we'll maybe just think of actually making ourselves into a trust, charitable trust, just get ourselves away from rates, just, you know, almost to put two fingers up in connection now. It's obviously not as easy as that, and that's it. But, you know, there will be people who, if they see particular opportunities, may well then just, but I appreciate them.
I suppose the only thing I can say about that is that if they, you know, if they can qualify for it, then yeah, but you know, you've got eligibility criteria set out, and you know, if a particular business qualified for that, then yeah, I suppose that there may be circumstances in which you might see a reduction in, you know, an additional reduction in rates revenue. Yeah, potentially.
Okay, Peter. Any other questions? Okay, Colin, thank you for that. And we'll move on to the next briefing, which is year-end surges in Northern Ireland Departmental Expenditure. Colin is going to give us a presentation on that particular issue. Whenever you're ready, Colin, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, again. This is a paper that I undertook, I suppose, proactively, looking at the expenditure of Northern Ireland departments across the board. It's essentially designed to try and enable further financial scrutiny by committees, which is the sort of strategic direction which has been set out by the Assembly. And what I've done here is presented an analysis of the outturn data which DFP provides to this committee every month. And it picks up on some observations by the National Audit Office and GB that Whitehall Department's expenditure is skewed towards the end of the year. And it just came about because I was reading a report. I saw this finding, and I just thought, well, I wonder if the same happens in Northern Ireland. But before we get into that, what I've done in the paper is I've explained what year-end surge is, the concept, and have reviewed the evidence that I could find in relation to any risks that such spending behaviour might give rise to. Then I've gone on in section 2 then to look at the public expenditure regime and controls, which have some sort of bearing on the way that expenditure is profiled by the public sector. Then there's an analysis of the profile of revenue and capital spend across Northern Ireland departments in total, and then there's a few scrutiny points raised towards the end. The concept of year-end surge is well established over a number of years. It's also known by a number of other terms. I mean, one term is called spending up to the budget. Another phrase which is used is use it or lose it. In essence, the public sector is prone to hold on to resources until the end of the year before spending it rapidly in the final months in order to ensure that the money is spent. Because if they don't spend it, on the basis of the annuality principle of allocations, then lose it. Now, this may be reflected by also uncertainty in the expenditure environment. So it may be a departmental response to not knowing exactly what issues are going to come up during the year, and then effectively what they're doing is hedging and saying, well, let's make sure we hold on to the resources so we can respond to unforeseen circumstances if we need to. In which case it would be, I suppose, a rational response. I've highlighted on page 6 a comment from the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, or CIPFA, where they've explained that part of the problem may be due to poor profiling of budgets, and that you then have what they call a spending frenzy in the last 3 months as departments try to spend up to the budget. And they have suggested that this doesn't intuitively suggest a robust approach has been used for forecasting expenditure. In other words, there's a concern that rapid increasing expenditure at the end of the year could lead to economically inefficient decision-making. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies have written in relation to the old end-year flexibility scheme that there's an incentive to spend inappropriately, effectively, at the end of the year for the fear of losing future allocations. So the question then is, okay, potentially there's a problem, and then to how much is this actually in evidence, or is it just a kind of construct that that doesn't exist? Pages 7 and 8, there is a quotation which refers to the persistent problem of year-end surging, and there have been a number of analyses, particularly in America, that point to this issue. And in fact, going back to the 1970s, the US Government Accounting Office, which is kind of the equivalent of our NAO, had observed that not only did year-end surging exist, but also that the managers responsible for those budgets didn't actually realise that it was happening, let alone be able to explain it. So subsequent to that report in the 1970s, the Senate subcommittee had said that the rush to obligate expiring funds before the end of the year resulted in a lack of competition, poorly defined statements of work, inadequately negotiated contracts, and the procurement of low priority items or services. So that's really capturing what the risk of this kind of spending behaviour might be. And then when the GAO returned to look at this issue again in 1998, they noted that there were more safeguards in place. The regime had changed. Although the incentive to spend quickly at the end of the year still remained, it was maybe less risky than it had been in the 1970s. I did come across a study of IT spending by US federal agencies between the years of 2004 and 2009. And that found not only does year-end surge exist, it also found that year-end spending was of a lower quality than expenditure taken earlier in the year. And the final point that the authors made then was that if you introduced a carryover system like budget exchange or end-year flexibility, it increased the quality of the expenditure. Again, another study in Oklahoma in the mid-2000s had identified the state agencies had exhibited this sort of behaviour. In GB, there's a chart on page 10 which just shows the extent of year-end or final quarter spending in Whitehall departments. And the National Audit Office included that poor forecasts of aggregate expenditure can lead to the late identification of under or overspending and rapid poor value for money responses. So again, that kind of supports the position that there may be concern about this issue. In section 2, I've set out a number of policy controls, public expenditure controls, which exist, that essentially establish, they establish a number of things. Firstly, that the Assembly is responsible for securing the economy, efficiency and value for money of expenditure through its scrutiny. The Treasury's Improving Spending Control document stated that there was no place for excess expenditure or low-value expenditure in the last quarter. In generating the old end-year flexibility scheme, that was clearly designed to try and address this situation. But when that was abolished in 2010 and the stocks were cancelled, it was replaced with a more limited system, the budget exchange scheme. So I suppose that's revealed a tension between the objective of government in terms of securing the highest value spend it can, but also the requirement to achieve a fiscal consolidation and therefore tighter control over expenditure. So that's at the UK level. At the Northern Ireland level, there are a number of references in various DFP documents. Managing public money in Northern Ireland essentially underscores the accounting officer's role and obligation to deliver value for money for expenditure. The department's in-year monitoring guidelines require departments primarily to avoid overspending and surrender resources at the first available opportunity. That's through the identification of expenditure as the year develops. And in theory, this should help avoid, I think, suboptimal year-end expenditure. The department's forecast outturn guidance requires departments to accurately report their patterns of spend and to explain any year-end surges in terms of the correct reporting of those, so that if there are any unusual trends or numbers in their reporting, that they explain what those are. So I'm taking this as evidence that the department is clearly aware that there is some sort of an issue around year-end expenditure. Beyond that, one of the American studies made the point, I think it was the GAO, that you shouldn't assume automatically that year-end expenditure is bad, because profile of a department spend could depend on all sorts of things, and there may be totally legitimate factors that explain the pattern. So I'm not trying to suggest automatically that year-end expenditure is bad or bad value, just that there is potentially a risk. So to move on to the profiles of the expenditures, there's a chart on page 19, figure 1, which looks at the capital expenditure of departments and arm's-length bodies. Now, this shows basically the amount of expenditure in each month over 3 years, and then the second column from the right, which is the hatch column, is the average expenditure in the months of April to February, and then to the right of that is the March expenditure. And as you can see from the chart, there's a considerable jump. It's around 300% in those years 10 to 11 to 12, 13, which is obviously significant. And then across the page there is a similar chart for resource expenditure. Now, there's a much less significant jump in the final year's expenditure from the average, although it's around 25% over those 3 years again, so it's still relatively significant. What I've done for each department is just show whether they are higher or lower than the departmental, or rather the Northern Ireland-wide average, just to see which departments are more prone to spend more in the final month, I suppose is the way to put it. And then there are charts then of each department's expenditure in the appendix. Sorry. So, I'm just trying to see. I've written it down there. Yeah. So it's DFP's own expenditure profile is on page 37, 38 in the appendix. So you can see that certainly in terms of capital, there is a fairly significant increase, and well, actually the same applies for resource expenditure, although it's less so than capital. But I think you would expect resource expenditure not to be as susceptible to this behaviour, because a lot of it is related to staff pay, which is fairly steady across the year. So I suppose the question then is, as ever, is so what? And in the final section, I've just raised some questions, I suppose, that the committee may wish to consider. The charts confirm that the year-end surge in expenditure does exist in the departmental profile of monthly expenditure. The Treasury has highlighted the role of legislative scrutiny, I suppose, in terms of looking at this spending behaviour. And Franklin and Douglas had observed that scrutiny provides a moral incentive to control or maybe influence the behaviour of departments. So if there is an issue around the value for money in that end-of-year expenditure, the fact that the Assembly is raising questions or looking at it should, in theory, provide an incentive to reduce that risk for departments. So what I've suggested is that statutory committees may want to look at the charts for their departments and consider asking for explanations of any patterns. And in particular, I think, because of the requirement in DFP's guidance that departments explain their expenditure profile, the statutory committees could quite easily ask their departments for copies of any explanations they have provided to DFP. And then for this committee in particular, there are some points raised in the box on page 25, essentially to ask the department whether or not it has conducted any analysis on the value for money risks that may be presented by this pattern of spending, to ask whether or not the department has been provided with the explanations that it has sought, whether there are any steps it can take beyond what it has already put into guidance to understand the reasons for year-end surges and any relationship there might be with value for money risk, and to identify further steps that could be taken to counter year-end surges. Now, bearing in mind that Northern Ireland is constrained by the Treasury expenditure system in terms of end-of-year carryover, that may be quite limited, but the question may be asked nevertheless. And then one final point I have raised, and it's something that this committee has come back to a number of times in relation to annual or multi-annual budgets, is that one of the arguments for having a multi-year budget has repeatedly been that the four-year process allows better certainty, gives better certainty to departments in terms of planning their expenditure and looking across the four-year period rather than a one-year period. And I suppose the question then is, does the evidence of the way this expenditure is drawn down support the argument that a four-year budget has allowed for better planning? Because if it has, why is all the expenditure occurring in the final month of the year? So, and I made a bit of a meal of that. It's actually a relatively simple paper making a simple point, you know, and suggesting some questions that could be asked. And if there are any questions for me, I will take them gladly.
Well, have you any? Obviously, There may be a number of causes for the end-of-year surge. Have you identified any particular causes?
Only anecdotally. One of the issues is that potentially that when a department has its budget confirmed by the passing of the Budget Act at this time of year, effectively, if there are programmes or projects that require expenditure, see, there has to be an economic appraisal case prepared. And one of the issues may be the length of time that takes to get through and get approvals. So it might be that actually the expenditure is ready to go, but it's being held up by other factors.
Legal challenges as well.
Potentially, legal challenges could be an issue as well. But I haven't looked in any detail. All I have done effectively is look at the reported spend pattern, and I haven't sought to investigate what the reasons might be. Part of it, I think, is explained by the who was it? Was it SIPFA, I think, who said basically that the incentive is there to hedge and make sure that you don't get caught out in November, having run out of money. So you try and delay the payment of...
Have you made any distinction between resource and capital in this?
Yes, there is a distinction. Yeah, the resource expenditure shows much less of a surge than capital. Capital surge is much more. And capital expenditure is probably more volatile because it's not... Resource expenditure, certainly in the likes of a department like DFP, would be pretty flat, you would think, because it's mostly salaries, wages, and therefore, you've got a predictable profile of monthly outgoings.
You would need a certain amount of analysis of, what exactly the money was spent on.
Yeah.
In order to evaluate whether it was authentic, useful, productive spending, or just a clearing out of the coffers.
You would, and that's really the thrust of what I've suggested. The committee should ask to what extent DFP has ever done that. I would be surprised if they haven't. So it would be, I suppose, just in terms of receiving assurance that money is being spent optimally rather than in a kind of dash at the end of the year, which may lead to if you're rushing to spend quickly at the end of the year, there are potentially maybe procurement risks because you might be required to take a less full procurement approach than you may be less competition. It may also impact on the market. You may find that if you're only tendering for something later in the year, the market is less able to respond in the way that it might have done had it had longer to respond earlier in the year, and you may find that competition might be constrained by that. There are all sorts of factors that could come into play, and I suppose the purpose of this paper is just to suggest that the Assembly might want to ask those questions.
Might be the case that the four-year budget places less urgency on departments to move projects forward, and that if you had an annual budget there would be much more urgency.
Well, the argument for the multi-year budget has always been that it allows certainty, but to an extent it doesn't, because until the whole estimates process and Budget Act is passed, I guess departments can never be sure, and they don't have the legal authority to draw down the money. So you can't say, right, we know because in the budget in 2016 we're going to have this amount of capital money. Circumstances can change, and they may not get the allocation that is planned for. So I suppose that undermines that argument that it provides certainty. if a multi-annual budget did provide certainty, then I would expect to see less of a spike in expenditure in the final month. I suppose that's really the point.
Okay. Any other members with questions?
Chair, I appreciate that. I think it's a good piece of work in that regard. I suppose there's different measures we could look at. I suppose the issue is trying to think around on almost anything you do, where the advantages are and where the drawbacks are, and to what extent with some of these things. I mean, to take an example, on if you have, for example, level carryover, does that mean you have a certain amount of money that's already in the system that's not being used, and consequently that's not ideal? Do you have a situation at present, for example, if you're saying, well, actually we want to avoid the surge, to some extent, the surge might also reflect a degree of, maybe it's overconfidence, but also actually a degree of prudence within particular departments.
Absolutely.
That almost the ones then that with least surge will be the ones that maybe are more cavalier towards the early part of the, so there's that element as well. And I suppose to some extent the other thought just occurs to me a little bit is whatever way you set up deadlines or periods, and you may be able to get different bits on it, to what extent is there an element of human nature we're actually trying to counteract? And not only just with the issue of caution, I suppose there's a bit sort of like the analogy of a lot of, like most students, if you're given 2 weeks to do your homework, 9 out of 10 students will actually leave it to the night before they have to hand in the assignment to finish off the thing on it, and is it almost an element of people will take a particular attitude of, well, actually I'm not concentrating my mind on getting everything sorted out until we get to the deadline, and I appreciate there's good reasons also to have certain range of controls within things on it. I suppose it may be less of a question, more of amusing in that regard, and to see where it's right to have constraints and where it's right to have flexibility on that bit, and trying to sort of tease out what the right balance in those type of things.
No, absolutely. There's all sorts of factors that may be applicable, and absolutely, human nature is clearly going to be one. And, caution, and I'm sure rightly, any assembly committee would take a very dim view of a department that spent all its money in the first couple of months and then ran out. So really, I suppose the only crucial point here is to what extent does DFP evaluate the profile in relation to any risks that it may cause for value for money? That's the issue. Is the profile leading to a reduction in the value for money, that if there was a smoother profiling of expenditure, would we get better outcomes, or more for slightly less, or would we get better solutions in terms of the way that issues are tackled if you dealt with them earlier in the year? That's the crux of it, I think.
Okay, Mitchell.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the litmus test is whether there are any issues in terms of value for money.
Absolutely.
And the mechanisms by which that can be explored. Did you check to see if the audit office, our own audit office, had reported on any concerns in relation to value for money issues, particularly in terms of end of year surge?
No, well, yes, I did check, and no, I didn't come across anything specific in relation to year end. And obviously, the audit office frequently raises value for money concerns. That's what it does. But that's something that I didn't find an analysis equivalent to what the National Audit Office had done.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that at some stage there haven't been individual recommendations, perhaps in reports that,
No, I mean, of course, the executive and the departments and agencies and arm's length bodies, they don't exist in a bubble. They're dealing with many interfaces with, I suppose, commercial and financial and industrial life, and people who are managing their own kind of, say, tax liability profiles and whatever, so they could actually dictate when they want to draw down or when they want to proceed, particularly if you're talking about not just multi-annual budgets, but in terms of industry, multi-annual development projects, and they will want to kind of smooth out their particular issues as well, and do that in conjunction or in negotiation with departments. Which for me means that there is at times very clear logic in terms of the wider economy for this end of year surge, because it has to do with the rollover from one tax year into the next. And you can, when I see the particularly the capital kind of profile of ETI at the end of the year, I think it's 300% or something. And yet that's a very good department as far as I'm aware in terms of the particular work and task that has to do. So I assume it has to do with the clients that they're dealing with and meeting their requirements as well. At least I suspect that would turn out to be the explanation. What I am keen to know is, does this report of yours is very interesting, and I think it sets out all the key elements. Does it indicate that, for instance, our own in-year monitoring process is faulty to some extent? And does it raise questions about the financial projection process that we have as well? I would just wonder if departments are coming towards a situation that demonstrates, according to the statistics that you have, that there is a surge across every single one of the departments, some of the much larger than others, and maybe for particular and understandable reasons, that whether it's resource or capital. But those same departments may very well be making bids for additional resources, say, coming up to the last monitoring round of any particular financial year as well. I'm just wondering if anybody's cross-checking and looking at that, and whether that indicates, A, that departments are still succeeding in hiding money that they intend to spend before the end of the year, but camouflaging it for bidding purposes. In
terms of the in-year monitoring process, it's quite difficult to draw, I suppose, a linkage without going beyond the level of data which I have here, which is at the
I'm sure it's
top level of the
for anybody but DFP to do it.
Yeah, that's right. But I'm sure it would be feasible to do it. We have another project that we're working on at the moment, looking at the in-year monitoring process in terms of the bidding element, and we've asked all the departments to provide us with copies of all of their bids over the current budget period, and the idea is that we will be able to use those and see. We're going to attempt to analyse the extent to which the inescapable bids, say the highest priority ones, have been met, or the extent that perhaps lower priority bids are being met, and those kind of issues. In terms of the relationship between in-year monitoring and surge, I'm not sure. The departments can only spend the amount that they have in their budget. So if they're bidding for additional resources, it's because they want to undertake something additional to what they're already funded
within
for.
Their allocation.
So I think, I suppose, to come back to it, really, the key is that like you say, there could be all sorts of perfectly good reasons for this, and it's. I mean, I don't want to labour it, but it's just a question of, those policy documents suggest that something that the Assembly may wish to be paying attention to, and because the pattern, I guess, is so stark, I think those questions could be asked, and then I suppose you move from then to seeing what comes back as to whether there's more issues that you want to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's entirely laudable that we're not handing money back. Not just hand money back to the centre, but handing it back to Treasury would be a bigger sin. And I think we are pretty well avoiding that. You know, there have been, over the years, there have been exceptions, but generally speaking, that was one of the early focuses of this committee as well. I think that the issue of whether or not there are value for money issues lurking in this is certainly worth exploring. We may find that the Audit Office have, in their work, already considered this matter and decided that they didn't need to investigate it, which would be a reassurance. I do think that we should continue to test for robustness our spending controls regime, because I think some of the departments, and particularly health, I think are struggling to stay within the spending controls limits, whilst at the same time bidding quite extensively for additional resource. So this may be just like a signal that it's time to just take a look at how we ensure, at the end of the day, prudent management of the existing budget and the delivery of value for money right throughout, and particularly towards the closing period of each, the closing quarter of each financial year. And I think the committee should consider maybe scoping out an exploration of this. It might involve some correspondence in the first instance with the Audit Office itself, I suspect, and then we can take it from there.
Okay, Leslie?
Thanks, Chair. Yes, it's very interesting, must say. It's certainly food for thought. I would support SIPA's view, I think. I think that's a big question mark over that whole thing. The one thing, though, to make this more meaningful, and it's not a criticism, if we had the phased budgets to go with it, to go with the phased expenditure. In other words, whenever the department's doing the budget, presumably it has worked out what the costs are on a monthly basis.
Well, the DFP provides the committee every month with the forecast outturn, which is done on a monthly basis. It's done right from the start of the financial year, so they will project how much goes into each. Sorry, excuse me. Will be spent in each month, and so what you're saying is, does the forecast differ from the actual in terms of at the start? I did look at that, and I found it very difficult to find a way of representing a relationship between the two, but essentially departments do forecast a backloaded expenditure profile.
But if they were sitting down, and I think the answer here is they don't. Sitting down, if you're looking at a budget, right?
Yeah.
They sit down in the budget for the year. They're focused on the budget for the year.
Yeah.
They should have, particularly with the capital work, a phased expenditure. This is the project we're looking at. This is what presumably has been agreed and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So expenditure will occur in months May, June, July.
After completion of the groundwork.
It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. I don't think it's done that way.
Right.
And just when I'm on that, I think the whole idea of 4-year budget's a lot of nonsense as well. Because what we're really talking about here is a long-range plan. And that's costed. That then becomes a budget. So you have a long-range plan for 4 years with attendant budget matching with it. But the difference is the budget is renewed every year. So that gets over the problem of capital spending, longer range stuff. That's the way it should be done. But it doesn't really happen. And one of the startling things out of your work, Colin, is to see the amount of overspend on resource is horrendous, particularly if you look at decal and DARD. It's absolutely horrendous.
Well, it's not overspend as such.
I'm talking about the spike.
Oh yeah.
Page 29. That's crazy. I can understand to some extent the capital. Presumably it's phased back. We don't know that because you don't have phasing. But whenever you look at the like of look at the resource there in DARD spent in March. How is that?
Yes, it is very high, absolutely, and that's really.
Is that more people coming in? What is it? Is it overtime? It's almost twice the average.
Yeah, It must be something to do with.
Shocking.
It's unlikely to be more people coming in. It must be something to do with perhaps. Maybe it's grant making or something. But the point is that it could be. It could be an issue that the Agriculture Committee might want to ask those very questions and say, and if it is, I'm speculating now, but if it were to do with the provision of grants, well, that has its own issues. Then it's one of the constant complaints from the voluntary sector is, why are we getting, we're waiting. The process for getting it is so drawn out.
Anyway, I think, Chair, Colin's point about the suggestion really that we write to the committees maybe and ask for comments on these would be helpful, just to paint the picture, because there's no doubt that there's the prima facie case that a lot of money spent at the year end. It's panic spending just to avoid the money going, and the question mark is it value for money? So good job.
There's something there we could maybe ask the public bench as well. They were read up that, for I think this is something that was interesting.
Okay, Colin. All right, thank you. Okay, members, apologies for being late. I had to go before another committee again.
Sorry, see on just Adrian's point?
Yeah.
I'm only just suggesting this. If it's recorded that we were considering writing to the public, it would actually maybe presume or give the impression that we had found something that should be examined. I think just if the audit office can respond that they have concerns or they don't have concerns, then we could come to the question separately. Would you, just in case it gets misinterpreted, which it might.
Good point.
Okay, members can propose to send the research paper to DFP for response and to other statutory committees.
Great.
Great. Moving on. Okay, can I seek agreement that in line with normal procedure committee goes into closed session for the next 2 agenda items? Agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Correspondence?
Okay, Chair, just draw out 2 items of correspondence, I think. Page 266 of the packet. The Department's just writing in response to the committee's query regarding the Minister's proposal to address the PSNI and IO equal pay issue, and just the committee had been seeking an update on that, and the Department's just responding. So it's just really to seek members, if they're content, to forward that to the original correspondent who raised the issue with the committee.
Agreed.
Yep, there's another email that I received. I think everybody might have received it from Paul Simpson. Would it be possible to share the information with him as well?
Yeah, I think that.
Okay.
Could can we address this question of the residual cases? And I mean, I am supportive of what the Minister has done in terms of finding a way of addressing this issue, and the language of moral responsibility obviously applies to the cases that he feels he can directly address. But it would still leave a number of outstanding. Is there a way of on a without prejudice basis, or without committing anybody, establishing just how many people feel that they would have an entitlement? No, some kind of open call. Because then we would have, an opportunity at least to explore the background information and to establish whether, there are other issues that we would regard, that we would agree are cases that would fall under this moral responsibility. Now, it may not be the type of information that would, at the end of the day, dramatically change the situation, but certainly would quantify the problem and maybe concentrate minds. I would see some difficulty in the Minister asking for that information because he makes policy, he makes decisions. I'm just wondering if the committee is in a position to gather that information, if you like, to kind of help the case. The other aspect of the approach is and this isn't in the public domain, so I'm not going to go into any detail, it wouldn't be appropriate. But the Minister has actually indicated how he thinks this might be funded. I understand that there might be a legal kind of issue involved in that. So we do need to know if funding mechanisms do exist that wouldn't be challenged and would allow the Minister, the Department, the Executive to respond.
Peter?
Yeah, I suppose just 2 points. First of all, I suppose in the latter point, if it's getting information on funding mechanisms, I don't have any major problem. I think possibly in the first point that Mitchell made, sympathy for what he's saying, maybe best if we can actually drill down and find out what the statistics of different categories are. I'm not sure how effective an open call would be, because I think the problem in that is there's a lot of people affected in different categories, or potentially might see themselves affected. You're probably then relying in terms of quantifying that on just who sees it and who responds. Whereas if we know, for example, and various categories could be identified and what statistically the numbers who would be. Because I think the other thing as well is, if you were agreeing, and I'm not quite sure which particular categories we would be talking about, but if you were agreeing that saying, well, there should be a certain amount of money given to people that fall into a particular category, well, irrespective of whether they feel a particular grievance or not, that will apply to everybody who's in that category. I'm just conscious that we may not get a proper handle on the size of the thing if we're simply looking for people to respond to us, as opposed to maybe whether there's some level of independent research, or research could be done to say, and I'm not quite sure which, if it's a question of, for example, well, if it's NIO staff, how many fall into that, if it's to do with the PSNI, if it's another particular type of secondment, if it's on the basis of, looking, here's the people that would fall in on the grounds of, say, in terms of when they retire. If there's different categories on that, I'm sure that maybe something can be drawn up in terms of finding out the stats on that. I'm not sure by way of simply making a public call that would be useful, because I'm not sure the statistics we're going to get back, because you're going to be very dependent upon who bothers to respond, who necessarily sees the thing, etc., etc. So I think it's just a better way of going about it.
Yeah, I don't think it helps.
Just bring on Dominic first, and then.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Chair. Did you recall that the Minister mentioned a sum of money that he had put aside for this issue? Did he mention that in the Assembly?
I don't think so.
I didn't think so
No.
either.
I think where there might have been at one stage, was there not, at some earlier stage, where actually I think maybe was there something that the Justice Minister mentioned at an early point, but that maybe money has then been spent or allocated elsewhere. I think there was maybe something, put by the Minister to the Executive, and I don't know if ever either figures were revealed in that, or whether they were even directly quantified in that. But I don't think he said anything directly in the Assembly on that point.
No, the reason I mentioned it was because, if there has been a certain sum set aside, that would seem to indicate that some sort of estimation of the numbers involved. I have some vague recollection of hearing the sum mentioned.
There was a figure of 6.8 million at one time, but then disappeared.
Right.
I think it was DOJ.
Chair, the Treasury had made an allocation, ring-fenced an amount of money. I can't remember precisely how much it was at the time of devolution of justice. If there was my recollection was if there was a legal obligation established. I'm not sure what the status of that is now. This was in respect to PSNI.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we could quantify the number of individuals who feel that they have a grievance through an open call. But the Minister is replying, you can see he's trying to be helpful to the committee here, has indicated the gaps of information, where there aren't records, where there wouldn't have been a departmental responsibility. But nonetheless, say for instance, even in terms of people who were working in what's described as the home civil service, so that different lines of accountability and presumably records keeping. But I think we could actually, through some mechanism, I'm not arguing that the proper body is the committee. It was only thinking out loud. A specialist research person might indeed come up with better information. But we could identify all the categories and the subcategories, and at least be able to, define what can be done to to establish the bona fides of those individual cases. There's no question in my mind that there's a lot of very aggrieved people out there. You know, and it was fairly succinctly put in the correspondence at the back of that table of paper by the legal person. I mean, they were doing exactly the same job, sometimes on the same premises, but certainly exactly the same jobs. But the terms and conditions were different, and so the equal pay legislation itself was an attempt to address that. In its implementation, and presumably its belated implementation, lots of people fell through that kind of safety net. If we're going to ever resolve it, I think we're going to have to try and quantify it. We're going to have to try and identify who they are and do it before time takes its toll.
Would it be useful then to do perhaps a closed session with DFP in terms of trying to scope all this out as a starting point? And then moving forward with it?
Because I think, I mean, to take on board, I think a closed session would be quite useful. I think some of the stuff, there might be danger that we're chasing wild geese in certain bits, whereas maybe other things we're not concentrating enough on. So I think
you're trying to be careful not to give hostages to fortune, you know.
or also as well maybe raise expectations in particular areas whenever.
Okay, that's a good suggestion. Yeah.
Okay, members.
Sorry, Chair. Okay, the other item of correspondence is page 271 of the pack. As the Consumer Council has written to highlight the impact on consumers of IT-related interruptions to banking services, especially in the context of branch closures and the increased reliance on online banking. They're offering to brief the committee on this and on the potential role the post offices could play in that regard. So it's just to take a view from members if they're content for a briefing from the Consumer Council scheduled after recess, with the possibility maybe even of arranging further hearings from the banks on the issue. It seems to apply to more than just the Ulster Bank that they're highlighting. It's applied to the other banks as well, these IT problems,
Agreed.
Even our own system doesn't work.
Just on that, Chair, the members got a note of the
Which one?
Ulster Bank closing 5 branches
One for your payroll.
yesterday.
It was down.
Doesn't say where.
It was down for a week.
Did they announce the news last night?
You can get on to get your P60.
Today.
No, it was a nice
This evening?
P60.
It wasn't an email now, but
Well,
it
it
was
was an email, but it was part of the things they mentioned.
Okay.
But Newton Abbey, I think about 3 in Belfast. There's Finicky, 2 others in Belfast, and then Hillsborough, I think.
to Lombard Street.
Lombard Street was one,
Lombard
yeah,
Street,
definitely. And I remember the fifth one, there was another one in Belfast. I think.
I think it was on Newton Alley, wasn't it?
There wasn't.
Yeah.
There wasn't.
Okay, sure.
Okay, Chair, that's all the correspondence.
Okay.
Happy Christmas.
Not yet.
Time of year already.
Fair members, the draft work programme, pages 273 to 77, and potential additional subjects for the work programme at page 278 of your packs. And Phil will speak to this.
All right.
Thanks, Chair. We're really just setting out post-summer recess, just the first 3 meetings. We're obviously anticipating a number of issues coming forward, such as the budget 15-16 and also the legal complaints bill, which we understand will be coming through in early October. So really the first meeting back is, I suppose, really just a catch-up session of really everything that's gone on today with regards to sickness absence, consideration of the reports and the flexible working inquiries. We have scheduled, subject to a committee agreeing, quite a bit of further follow-up session with officials from DFP on rating issues, purely because there were a number of matters that they wanted to come back and update the committee on. And we'll also hope to have our end of session report, which CLG agreed that we would provide, reflecting on last year's work. Week commencing the 15th September, the meeting, we've got a plan just on a briefing from DFP on borrowing, and that really flows out from the European Investment Bank and looking at other sources of borrowing. And if need be, there again a final consideration of the flexible working inquiries and sickness absence. And we were hoping, subject to confirmation from officials, that we would have to have the Minister up on the 17th along with the new Permanent Secretary. And then really finally on the 24th of September we will plan to have an October monitoring round session and also look at cost departmental performance against savings delivery plans. And CLG had also recently met with regards to strategic planning session, which members may recall we did last year, and that was following the Minister's briefing. So the plan would be that the committee are content that we would, following the Minister's briefing at the meeting the week later, primarily conduct an informal meeting, which really will just look to align on the Minister's priorities and really how that is shaped in our work programme going forward. And you know, the Secretariat will continue to work over the summer for the rest of the plan, because it's obviously just at the formulative stage at the moment. So if any members have got any views, that's fine. And then secondly, just at page 278 of your packs, the Secretariat have identified some other areas that may be of interest for agreement to schedule into the work programme, which is looking at public sector innovation labs, performance of individual DFP business areas against their own individual business plans, scheduling in up on the issue of building a prosperous and united community, which looks at devolution of fiscal powers, the executive's borrowing strategy, cross-departmental scrutiny of investor-save measures, which follows from the asset management strategy, and then also there again monitoring of benefits realisations with regards to shared services. So it's really a case, Chair, if members agree to all of those, or if they want to state any option of which they would prefer to schedule.
I think food schedule.
Members happy with all?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, can I seek agreement the committee writes to DFP seeking copies of each of its divisions' performance against their business plan objectives in line with the agreed additional issue?
Agreed.
Can I also advise members during question time yesterday the Minister indicated the DFP is seeking to consult on the issue of family law. Can I take members' views and whether they wish to request a briefing from DFP on that at a future meeting? Agreed. Members content the work programmes updated to reflect agreements made today.
Agreed.
Any other business? Can inform members normal practice for committees to delegate authority to chair and deputy chair during recess to submit views on the releasing or withholding of information and any non-routine contentious FOI requests received. Committee will be advised of any such requests and the views expressed by the chair or deputy chair, and the response issued by the FOI unit first available meeting following the recess period. Agreed?
Agreed.
And the next meeting will be 10th September at 10 a.m.